Good evening. It's my purpose to fight for your justice. That is not only my mantra, but the reality of God's calling on my life as attorney Rawsi Williams of Rawsi Williams Law Group. But what is justice? And how will we know when we have attained it? I submit to you today that it is when we can no longer say we still haven't seen it. In 1776, the framers of the Declaration of Independence wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Yet here we are in 2020, and at least for African American men, we still haven't seen it. In 1865, Congress abolished slavery through the 13th Amendment. In 1963, the late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington, where he looked forward to the day when we would no longer be judged by the color of our skin, but the content of our character. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. On April 3rd, 1968, Dr. King gave his final sermon at Bishop Charles H. Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, where he said, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land." On the following day, on April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, he was assassinated. Yet here we are in 2020, still fighting voter suppression nationwide. Still being followed from the time we enter a store until the time we leave. Still having the police called on us for selling lemonade where we live, being present where we live, living where we live, being in the lobby of the hotel where we stay, and studying at the colleges we attend. Justice, we still haven't seen it. Now, don't get me wrong. We as African Americans, we have a major role to play in not just entering, but occupying our promised land of justice. For time's sake, I'm gonna call them the 5 P's. Number 1, we gotta pray, but then get up. See, in today's society, the power of prayer and faith, it has been mocked so much, but I remind you that nothing is impossible with God, and prayer still works. But the reason we're not seeing the manifestation is because after we pray, when we get up, we won't do anything with the solution God gave us while we were on our knees. Faith without works is dead. You got to pray, but get up and do something about it. Number 2, we must preserve the legacy of those who have gone before us. You see, the great civil rights leaders are transitioning on to glory. And you are passing the mantle on to us. And so we have to get to the point where we begin to truly appreciate the fault you underwent so that I could go to Tuskegee, so I could go to FAM, so we could stand where we stand, and we have to stop mocking and ridiculing what you have accomplished, pretending like we got here by ourselves, like we didn't stand on your shoulders. Everything I am is because of you. But see, we as a younger generation, we have to get to the point where we stop mocking the fight. A great example is using the N-word, a word that was so degrading to our mothers and fathers that we now post on our social media as a term of endearment. Sing it in our songs, put it in our lyrics, and then have the audacity to come to us as attorneys and say, I need you to fight my case of racial discrimination because my boss called me the same N-word you got posted on your social media, and want us to go before a predominantly white jury who's been desensitized by your overuse of the word. And somehow say, well, because I changed the ER to A, that made a difference. Number 3, we must promote the interest of our future. Politically, economically, academically, in every way, we need to begin to optimize the platforms that are placed before us. We have to learn how to grab opportunity when it knocks at our door. And number 4, we must produce productive citizens. See, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am are still good responses. Teaching our children that your attitude affects your altitude is still a great truth. Teaching our children to value one another, to learn the power of words, so that they could become so knowledgeable that they could defeat their entire opponent, state their whole position, argue everything they do, and never use a word of profanity, never pull a gun, never use a knife. So strong in their words that by the time they finish, they're pulling the white sheet over their opponent because they cut their jugular with nothing but their vocabulary. Finally, we must pivot. In other words, sometimes you got to learn to turn toward a better future. Turn toward some things. Because you must understand that we cannot do this alone. It wasn't just black folks, right, who got us through the civil rights movement. So we cannot alienate other people, and we cannot paint others with the same broad brush that we don't want them to paint us with. We're talking about getting to the day of justice, right? Now, let me say this. I know that some of you, for those of you who are not the African Americans, I don't want you to think that I stand to chastise our people because I love us. I stand to empower us because I am an upsetter of the apple cart of injustice against us. So I say there are some things you have to do as well. You're going to have to admit to, manage, deal with, and resolve your implicit bias against us, your blatant racism against us, the racial insensitivity and injustices that have been wrought against us. Stop telling us to let it go. That slavery happened almost 400 years ago, and we ought to be over it by now. You see, my mother, I didn't say my grandmother or my great-grandmother, but my mother attended a segregated school in that old dirty South. That wasn't 400 years ago. And when I was a child, I didn't say my mother, but when I was a child, the Klan marched in my neighborhood, donned in white sheets and with a white hood. And they shot our cousin in the face because he had a white wife on his motorcycle, and his face still bears the sagging from the bullet wound today. Stop telling us to let it go, because this is what we still have not seen, the power of justice. Number 2, stop telling us that it's our fault when police officers wrongly kill and murder unarmed black men. Stop saying to us that if we'd only obey, if we just would do everything that we're told, if we put our hands at 10 and 2, then we wouldn't suffer this inequality. And for those who are wondering, I'm not anti-police. I represent them just like I sue them. Wherever the facts fall, that's how it works. So let me just tell you today, when you tell us that it's always our fault, and we look at Mr. Charles Kinsley, who is a therapist in Florida, lying on the ground with his hands up in the air, saying, I'm a therapist for the autistic kids, but the cops still shot him. When we look at Eric Garner selling cigarettes choke beyond I can't breathe. When we look at the situations that we see going all around, Philando Castile shot in the car in the presence of his 4-year-old stepdaughter for trying to get the ID that the officer requested of him. This is why we cry out justice. We still haven't seen it. By the same token, but when we look at someone like Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people in a South Carolina church, a knowingly armed mass murderer, but who got his day in court. When we look at James Holmes, who killed 12 people, a white male in Colorado in a movie theater and injured 70, held people hostage, but he still got his day in court. When we think about Jared Loughner, who shot Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords and so many others, still got his day in court. Eric Friend, a white man, killed a Pennsylvania state trooper, led them on a 6-week manhunt, still got his day in court. Nicholas Cruz killed 17 people at Parkland, still got his day in court. We can't do anything but say, I still haven't seen it. Now I want you to understand that together we can change this. It doesn't have to be like this always. But we need your help to acknowledge what has occurred. You cannot deal with a problem that you won't admit exists. The last thing we want you to do is to stop telling us that racism doesn't exist today. You see, until you've walked a mile in my shoes and the color of my skin, all you can do is speculate and have conjecture. Until you are so afraid to send your child to soccer practice, to volleyball practice, until you are so afraid to let your black kid even get on the bus, until you are so afraid to let your black kid even walk down the street, not because you're afraid Bubba and Pookie gonna kill him, but because the same officers that they got to call and ask for help, who hold the power of the pen to write the narrative of the encounter that goes to the prosecutor who decides whether to file charges, it's the person who takes their life. Then that's why you understand why we say justice, we still haven't seen it. So we ask you to stand with us. Help us. Help us to come in. Help us to gain this victory together. Help us to do what is necessary to come in and protect the legacy of those before us, to protect the interest of our future. Help us to pray, but then get up. Help us to produce positive citizens. Help us to pivot when we need. And most of all, understand the extent of our pain. It's so deep and the injury has metastasized so much that it has literally turned us inside out to where the very organs of our existence are laid bare before you. So that when we look at the situation of George Zimmerman suing the family of the kid he killed, when we see Botham Jean killed in his own apartment, our souls cry out, enough. 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 It's been a long time. Enough. How many more of our black men gotta die? Enough. How many more of us who go through this, will we keep fighting my mother's fight, my grandmother's fight, my great-grandmother's fight? Enough. Till that day when we can all no longer have to say, where is justice? Because we've seen it. Thank you.